Where is Blackfyre, the sword of Aegon the Conqueror and many other Targaryen kings? Will it make a reappearance in A Song of Ice and Fire? Let's take a look. Hi everyone, this is Robert. On this channel we dive deep into George R. R. Martin's world of Ice and Fire, as well as The Lord of the Rings, The Witcher and more. Welcome. There are many legendary Valyrian steel swords in the world of Ice and Fire, some that have been handed down generation to generation for centuries and with whom great deeds are accomplished. But perhaps the most famous of all is Blackfyre, the sword of Aegon the Conqueror himself. From him it was passed down generation to generation and king to king. Maegor wielded it, and Jaehaerys throughout his long reign, then Viserys. It survived the Dance of the Dragons, was used by Daeron I in his invasion of Dorne, and Aegon IV during his unworthy rule. Simply put, it was the Sword of Kings. We're told that even sheathed, the blade could be mistaken for no other. And from early on, it was seen as a mark of legitimacy for kings. After Aenys gave Blackfyre to his brother Maegor, Visenya opined that, "Why else would he have given Blackfyre to my son? He knows that only Maegor has the strength to rule." When Jaehaerys reached his maturity and flew to King's Landing to claim the throne, he wore no kingly garb, but very obviously carried Blackfyre with him. When Aegon II claimed the throne at the dawn of the Dance of the Dragons, we read that every visible symbol of legitimacy belonged to Aegon. He sat on the Iron Throne, he lived in the Red Keep, he wore the Conqueror's crown, wielded the Conqueror's sword, and had been anointed by a septon of the faith before the eyes of tens of thousands. It would be overstating the case to say that Blackfyre was the only symbol of legitimacy for Targaryen rulers, but it was a very, very important one. The Sword of Kings, and everyone knew it. Things became complicated, however, when King Aegon IV broke with protocol and didn't give Blackfyre to his eldest legitimate son Daeron, as tradition would have suggested he should have done. Instead, he gave it to one of his bastard children, Daemon Waters. This was understandable on one level, because Daeron was not a fighting type and Daemon definitely was, but still the sword was so laden with symbolism that when combined with Aegon IV's questioning whether Daeron was indeed his legitimate son, there's a whole other story there we'll get into at some point, lots of people interpreted the move as Aegon saying that Daemon should be king. Witness this conversation between Eustace Osgrey and Egg in The Swan Sword years later. Eustace Osgrey speaks first. Daemon was the better man. The old king saw it too. He gave the sword to Daemon, Blackfyre, the sword of Aegon the Conqueror, the blade that every Targaryen king had wielded since the conquest. He put that sword in Daemon's hand the day he knighted him, a boy of 12. "My father," says Egg, "says that was because Daemon was a swordsman, and Daeron never was. Why give a horse to a man who cannot ride? The sword was not the kingdom," he says. "Your father is a fool." Half the kingdom held the same view. Daemon even adopted Blackfyre as his surname to underline the importance of the gift, and the inevitable eventual result was the First Blackfyre Rebellion. The culmination of that was the Battle of the Redgrass Field. Daemon Blackfyre died on that field, with Blackfyre briefly being taken up by his son Aemon before he too died. Then Aegor Rivers, Daemon's half-brother and one of the great bastards of Aegon IV, took it up, fighting Bloodraven no less, who was wielding Dark Sister. Bittersteel took out Bloodraven's eye, but the battle was lost and he fled, the rebellion abandoned to exile in Essos. Though we have no first-hand accounts of the sword Blackfyre in Essos, it's pretty clear everyone believes it to be there in Bittersteel's possession. For example, during the abortive Second Blackfyre Rebellion, which was seeking to place Daemon II Blackfyre on the Iron Throne, one point of contention among the rebels was that Bittersteel hadn't given the sword to Daemon II. In The Mystery Knight, Lord Butterwell says, "He does not bear the sword. If he were his father's son, Bittersteel would have armed him with Blackfyre." There are several possible reasons why Bittersteel didn't give Daemon the sword, but the important point here is that he has it, and seemingly reserves the right to decide who it goes to. For me, what is odd is not that Bittersteel didn't give it to one particular Blackfyre heir, it's that he didn't give it to any of them. He did support Haegon Blackfyre in the Third Blackfyre Rebellion, crowning him and fighting alongside him, but we don't hear of Blackfyre being there. Haegon was disarmed and killed, and Aegor himself captured, but no Blackfyre. Bittersteel similarly supported Daemon III Blackfyre in the 4th Blackfyre rebellion. Sir Duncan the Tall killed that Daemon, but still no Blackfyre. Bittersteel was dead by the time of the last Blackfyre Pretender and the War of the Ninepenny Kings, but still no sword Blackfyre. So, where is it? It was last seen in Essos, but then what? Well, before we get on to the majority view among the fandom, that it is still in Essos, let's just cover off a few other possibilities. It seems pretty clear that it wasn't regained by any of the main Targaryen family or other loyalists during various rebellions. This would have been a big win for them, and would surely be taken back by whichever king was on the throne at the time. Perhaps Bloodraven took it for his own mysterious purposes and then hid it from everyone. He did duel Bittersteel twice, after all. While I wouldn't discount this, you know I'm always a sucker for a good Bloodraven theory, it does seem to be stretching credulity a bit to suggest he could smuggle it off the battlefield without anyone noticing, or even noticing that Bittersteel was wielding it in the first place. This is a big and famous sword, so probably not. As a complete aside, we do have one very specific confirmation from George R. R. Martin, from back when George R. R. Martin often answered questions from fans. He was asked whether Longclaw might be Blackfyre. He simply said no. Or perhaps some other completely random person got hold of it somehow by stealing it from the battlefield or Bittersteel. In the real world, that's a very realistic possibility, but George R. R. Martin has repeatedly emphasised the importance of this sword, so it seems likely that it will make a return, and hasn't just been melted down and resold somewhere in deeper Essos. So let's go with what everyone in-world thinks. Bittersteel had it in exile, but then kept it without passing it on to any of the successive Blackfyre heirs. Why? Well, we often assume that Bittersteel is the Blackfyre loyalist-in-chief, but clearly his loyalty wasn't without any boundaries. He actively didn't support the clear Blackfyre heir in the Second Rebellion, and though he did support later heirs, he seems not to have given any of them the single biggest symbol of legitimacy that he had. So maybe he had another agenda going on. Let's briefly look into his background and see what that might be. Bittersteel was born of Aegon IV's fifth mistress, Barbara Bracken, and while he was still newborn, the king's wife, Nerys, nearly died, leading to talk that maybe Barbara might become the new queen, and giving Bittersteel, by implication, a legitimate claim to the throne. When Nerys didn't die, the Brackens became unpopular at court for overstepping their place and were banished back to Stonehenge. Barbara's place as king's mistress was taken by Melissa Blackwood, who bore him a son, Brynden Rivers, aka Bloodraven. That was the start of Bittersteel's feud against Bloodraven, which was further exacerbated when their half-sister Shira Seastar chose Bloodraven, not him. When everyone was grown up and it was obvious that of all of the great bastards, Daemon was the one people would be most likely to rally around, Bittersteel threw his lot in with him. He pushed Daemon to claim the throne for himself. Bloodraven, needless to say, was a staunch supporter of Deer I, who was currently sat on that throne, and although we have very little detail on this, we're told in the World of Ice and Fire that Daemon agreed to wed his eldest daughter, Calla, to Aegor. And separately, we're told that Bittersteel was angry all his life. When you take all this together, it seems that at the very least Bittersteel was motivated not so much by a belief that Daemon was the rightful king, as a hatred of Bloodraven. Maybe he even saw Daemon's rebellion as a chance to get at Bloodraven, more than a matter of putting the right man on the throne. If that's the case, it explains why he might not have thrown his full support behind all of Daemon's descendants, and why, in both of the first rebellions, he ended up in a one-on-one duel with Bloodraven on the battlefield. Might he have harboured some thoughts that he should have been king, or perhaps his descendants should be, hence him asking to marry Daemon's oldest daughter? Though, if so, even that was thwarted. Back in 2018, friends of the channel History of Westeros got the opportunity to ask George R. R. Martin whether Bittersteel had any children. His response was, "I don't think so." Which is all a bit of a digression, and we'll probably not know all the ins and outs of Bittersteel's character until we get to Fire and Blood Part 2, or perhaps we'll learn some more in future Dunk and Egg stories. But what we do know is suggestive that Bittersteel wasn't necessarily a Blackfyre absolutist. He only threw his weight behind someone he thought would be a good king or had a good chance of being king. He had Blackfyre and was extremely picky about who he gave it to. We also know he was the kind of person to think ahead and care about his legacy, because he founded the Golden Company to act as a standing army for the next invasion attempt, and even left a bizarre demand that the Golden Company should dip his skull in gold and carry it before them when they finally head back over the narrow sea to retake the throne. Everything we know about him suggests that he will have planned ahead about what to do with Blackfyre. He wouldn't have necessarily given it to who he thought was the rightful Blackfyre heir. He himself held onto it, after all, despite never claiming to be the rightful heir himself. He saw himself more as a kingmaker, throwing his support behind candidates he liked, but not those he didn't. And very probably he will have thought that to succeed, even long after his death, with his skull still figuratively leading the Golden Company into battle, remember, would be his way of finally getting one over on Bloodraven, who had thwarted him so often in life. So he will probably have given the sword to someone who he felt was most like him, someone who would eventually fulfill his dream of leading the Golden Company across the narrow sea and placing a Blackfyre on the Iron Throne. And not just any Blackfyre, but one who was fit to rule. And perhaps they in turn gave it to someone else to keep the dream alive. So is there anyone in the books who has been doing just this, plotting for years, raising up a claimant to the Iron Throne who is worthy, hiring the Golden Company and getting them to sail across the narrow sea? Well, yes, there's someone who's been doing all of that. Illyrio Mopatis. Okay, so that might feel like a big leap from Bittersteel to Illyrio, but they do definitely seem to both want the same thing. You may remember in a previous video I set out the argument that young Griff, the man claiming to be Aegon VI, is actually perhaps a secret Blackfyre through the female line, and probably also the son of Illyrio himself and his very Valyrian-featured second wife Sarah. If we hadn't had that confirmation from George R. R. Martin that Bittersteel didn't have any children, I'd wonder if Sarah was a descendant of his and Calla's. Anyway, Illyrio seems to be in the business of trying to put a Blackfyre on the Iron Throne, pretending that they are a Targaryen. He's already gifted Daenerys with 3 dragon eggs at huge cost and negotiated to get the Dothraki to join the invasion. And then, after his plans changed a little, got the Golden Company on board, with Varys then recruiting Barristan Selmy, the legendary commander of the Kingsguard. Where does all this leave the sword Blackfyre? Dragon eggs and Barristan Selmy are good symbols of a sort of legitimacy to have with you, but the sword Blackfyre, the sword of kings, would be even better. Might Illyrio have it? He is the one taking on the Bittersteel Kingmaker role here. If so, we might expect him to get it to young Griff in time for his assault on King's Landing. Some people may rally to him for that reason alone. As it happens, there is a hint of this. Before the release of A Dance with Dragons, George R. R. Martin did several readings of draft chapters. One of them, a Tyrion chapter, where he is talking with Illyrio, included this intriguing segment, as recalled by someone who was there. The summary we have is that Illyrio says he wants to give young Griff his blessings and has a gift for him in the chests. Howland tells him there is no time for the litter. Illyrio gets angry and says there are things Griff must know. Howland eyes Tyrion and then begins to speak in another language. Tyrion cannot tell what it is but thinks it might be Volantine. He catches a few words that come close to High Valyrian. The words he catches are queen, dragon, and sword. So there's something secret going on here, something the plotters don't immediately want Tyrion to know. The references to Queen and Dragon are almost certainly about Daenerys. The plan at this stage is to marry young Griff to Dany, so that they can jointly retake the Seven Kingdoms with her dragons, but the reference to a sword, which other sword could this be about than Blackfyre, the sword of the Targaryen kings? To be clear, that section wasn't included in the final draft, implying he either changed his mind or he was saving the revelation until later in the books, something he has done on several other occasions. Some rather large chests were still loaded onto the Shy Maid, though. They apparently contain a variety of things, including armour, money, clothes, and gifts for Daenerys. So perhaps George decided to keep going with the idea, but make it less obvious there was some big secret here. In any event, I think we have here the closest thing we're going to get to an answer on Blackfyre. Unless Bloodraven took it and stashed it somewhere for his own nefarious reasons, Bittersteel had it, and was keeping it not just for whoever happened to be the Blackfyre heir, but for someone special in the future. Perhaps he was even one of those Targaryens who gets prophetic dreams, and he had a vision of someone the sword had to be held for. I wouldn't rule it out. It's most probable that he then passed it on to someone or some people who would keep on with his vision. The Golden Company were founded to be an army of this future leader. And probably today, Illyrio has that sword and is honouring the wishes of his dead wife Sarah in placing their son on the Iron Throne and giving him that sword to bolster his legitimacy. While there is a lot we don't know here, this does currently seem to be the most likely place for Blackfyre to be, and all the other theories have even less evidence. So, come the winds of winter, we will perhaps see young Griff, with silver hair newly washed clean from the hair dye, holding Blackfyre aloft as he enters King's Landing to the acclaim of the crowd, a Blackfyre pretending to be a Targaryen, or as Dany sees in the House of the Undying, a cloth dragon swayed on poles amidst a cheering crowd. Perhaps. It's just a theory, but I think it's the best we have at the moment. But what do you think? Where do you think Blackfyre is? If you'd like more videos like this, digging into the deeper lore of A Song of Ice and Fire, there's a playlist now on the left of your screen. Or to support this channel, thank you. There's a link to my Patreon page on the right of your screen. Thanks for watching. That's all for this time. I'll see you again soon.